Today I want to talk about adult Christians living in the world today, but let's just start with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, we're thankful for this venue and for the freedom to worship you. We ask that your Spirit would be with us. Let the words that are spoken be not mine, but yours, and prepare our hearts for your message. In Jesus' name, amen. You know, it's interesting how the Lord guides in our lives in various different directions. You know, I became a pediatric neurosurgeon, but I was an adult neurosurgeon first. But I acquired a lot of the skills that I have in Australia. Now, I had no intention of going to Australia. But when I was invited to come, I said, Australia? You gotta be kidding me. I said, you drill a hole from Baltimore, you come out in Australia. I really wasn't that interested. Plus, I'd heard they had a whites-only policy, so I said, I'm not that interested. But every time I turned around, there was somebody saying, good eye, mate. I just kept running into Australians everywhere. They seemed like nice people. And there were all these specials on television about Australia. And I said to Candy, I think the Lord wants us to go to Australia. So she did a bunch of research, and she discovered one thing is that they did have a whites-only policy, but it was an unofficial policy that had officially been abolished in 1968. And this was 1983. So we sold all of our earthly belongings and off we went to Australia. And our friends were saying, you'll be back in 3 weeks. But little did they know, we didn't have any more money, so we couldn't come back. But we had a very good time there. The Aussies love Americans, but the women who transcribed the operative notes were always calling me up and saying, Dr. Carson, we can't understand your accent. And I would say, I'm the American, you have the accent. But the wonderful thing is, I learned a lot of techniques, and I got very good at a lot of things because there were only 4 neurosurgical consultants in all of Western Australia. And once they discovered that I could operate, they left me largely in charge of the main teaching hospital, and they'd go out to the private hospitals. So I was doing 3 or 4 major craniotomies every day. And one of the things that I really became very facile with is the treatment of trigeminal neuralgia, which is a condition, a very, very painful condition. Feels like lightning strikes in your face. And it used to be called the suicide disease because it was so painful that people who had it often committed suicide because they just didn't want to deal with it anymore. And we had a number of surgical techniques that were useful in getting rid of it. And it was the only adult procedure that I maintained throughout my entire career. So even though I was the head of pediatric neurosurgery, the adults that I dealt with had trigeminal neuralgia. And that was something that God orchestrated. And he orchestrates so many things in our lives. And we used to feel very free to talk about those things. You know, when I became the secretary at HUD, a high government official came to me and he said, we are so thrilled that you've taken this position, and we know you're going to bring a lot of good to government, but you have to stop all the God stuff. I tell him to go jump in the lake. Because the God stuff is why this country thrived. There's no question about it. Our very initial document, the Declaration of Independence, says that our rights come from our Creator and not from government. They can't be taken away by anyone. And our Judeo-Christian foundation is essential to who we are as a people, and we should never allow anybody to get rid of it. And that's one of the reasons that President Trump established the Freedom of Religion Commission. And we had our first meeting last Monday. You know, Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick of Texas is the chairman, and I was appointed the vice chairman. There are people like Kelly Shackelford, who's argued many cases for religious freedom in front of the Supreme Court. Franklin Graham, Dr. Phil, Eric Metaxas, and a number of other people. And to really look at policies and things in our country that stifle the whole concept of religious freedom. Look at some of the things that have happened. Go back to May of 2020 when Pastor Mark McClure of the Calvary Chapel Church in California, you know, he was kind of fed up with the fact that the state had all these regulations and you weren't even able to go to church. And if you were in church, you had the mask and you could only be 6 feet apart. And they put all kind of incentives in there so that you could rat on your neighbor if they were doing something that was inappropriate. You know, these are things that are antithetical not only to religious freedom, but to freedom in general, which is one of the reasons that so many people came to this country from other parts of the world. They wanted to be able to live the lives that they wanted to live, and they wanted to be able to believe what they believed in. And we've seen so many examples. You know, the people who were protesting peacefully in front of abortion clinics, not obstructing anybody's entrance or egress. They were arrested, and some of them were put in jail. Think about that. In the United States of America, one of the first group of people that President Trump pardoned were those who were still in jail for peacefully standing out in front of those clinics, singing songs, offering prayers, and talking about the fact that God values everyone, even little babies who can't speak for themselves in their mother's womb. But this is why we need a freedom of religion commission in this country. And you think about our history. You think about the people who were our founders, people like George Washington. People like to say that our founders were deists, people who believed that maybe there was a God, but that he wasn't involved in our lives. But you wouldn't say that if you read some of the writings of people like George Washington, who was a very devout man of faith. And some of you may know the story of the bulletproof Washington. It used to be in all of our history books. You know, when he was a young man, he was a courier for General Braddock during the French and Indian War. And all of the couriers were shot dead, except him. He had 2 horses shot from beneath him. He had 4 bullet holes in his petticoat. He had bullet fragments in his hair, but no flesh wounds. And some years later, he was in the area again. It was still before he was president. And one of the Indian chiefs that had been involved in that war was very elderly at that time and not going to be around for much longer. And he said to his braves, "Take me to this man. I want to see him before I die." And they brought him into the presence of Washington. And he said, "Sir, I am an expert marksman, and I shot you 17 times. And my men shot you, and pretty soon I just told them to stop shooting at that man because you're just wasting your bullets. And I wanted to meet the man who is protected by the Great Spirit above, who will become the father of a great nation. Think about that. That was the Battle of Monongahela outside of Pittsburgh. Well, as you may recall, there was an incident last year in Butler, Pennsylvania. And another future president avoided death by bullet by millimeters. Butler, Pennsylvania is only 57 miles away from Monongahela in the same state where God intervened. And I think last night we saw one of the reasons for that intervention, because we needed someone to stand up before there was a big mushroom cloud. You know, God knows what he's doing, and, you know, he can protect people. But here's the difficult thing sometimes for Christians. Where does compassion join with reality? We have a situation where we have people who want to destroy us and our way of life. Should we just be compassionate and say, well, you know, they're good people there, and we really shouldn't interfere with what they're trying to do? Is that what the Bible says? You know, David and his men were instructed by God in the face of evil to destroy the evil. All of it. The goats, the chickens, everything. Don't bring evil into your presence. But there's always carnage when you do that. And I think that's where the Christian principles come in. Not that we should necessarily try to stop warfare where it's appropriate, but we should be compassionate and try to help people in the aftermath of that. This is what a Christian attitude would be. We should try to create peace wherever we can create peace, but we have to be logical in the way that we do things. You know, again, come back to the immigration issue. All of us understand why most people who live in situations that are not very pleasant would want to come to this country. Even though we have a lot of people who say that this is a horrible country and that we're systemically racist and that we treat people unfairly. If it's all that bad, why are all these people trying to get in here? You know? Obviously, that's not the case. So we understand why they're trying to come, and we can sympathize with that. But does that mean we should leave our borders wide open so that anyone can come in? You know, guess what? We are going to pay the price, because there are a lot of terror cells that came in here through that southern border, and they're going to be activated, and we need to be praying for the protection of God. That's what's going to save us. But we need to always remember compassion and mix compassion with logic and common sense. The people who say we should have open borders, what I always say to them is, when you go home this evening, if there's a bunch of people in your house that you didn't invite who said that they needed a house to stay in, And would you say, oh, okay, no problem, you can just stay here? I don't think so. I don't think the most liberal of them would say that. And they have to recognize that it comes at a cost. And, you know, giving people medical care, housing, all these other supplements, it comes at a cost. And when you're in a situation where you're deeply in debt, you have to be careful. You can't just keep spending money. No one does that in their own house. And think about it, every time you get on an airplane, what do they say? In case of emergency, oxygen mask will drop down. Put yours on first and then help your neighbor. If you don't put yours on first and you get asphyxiated, you're not going to be any good to anybody. And by the same token, if we go off the financial cliff, we're not going to be good for anybody. So we have to be smart enough to understand that. Doesn't mean that we are non-compassionate people, but it means that we're using that brain that God gave us. Also, thinking back to George Washington, Donald Trump, God intervening to save them. Think about your own life. How many times God has intervened to save you? You know, a lot of times we don't think about it. And how many times does he save us when we're even unaware that we were in danger at all? I think about some of the times in my life. I remember once I was in Hawaii, and I had gotten there a little early. So the sponsor said, would you like to see the Glacier Valley? And I said, oh, that would be really cool. So I go up in a single engine plane, just me and the pilot, over the mountains and down into Glacier Valley. And it was surreal. It was like you were on a different planet. It was amazing. But this plane only flew by sight. It did not fly by instrument. And heavy cloud cover came in. You couldn't see anything. And the pilot said, we're in trouble. Well, I knew that already. And he said, I'm going to climb as fast as I can without stalling out, and hopefully we won't hit a mountain, because there were mountains on all sides. And we're climbing through the cloud. You can't see anything. And of course, I'm praying. And we finally broke cloud cover and saw that we missed the mountain by about 3 feet. So I was very thankful after that. And then there was a time I was in the Bahamas. I was in Freeport speaking, and the people in Nassau heard that I was there, and they said, you got to come to Nassau, you're already over here. So they sent a twin-engine plane to pick me up. And we were about 10 miles from the shore when one of the engines went out. And the plane, instead of flying this way, was flying this way. And the pilot once again said, we're in trouble. Well, once again, I knew that. And I had already gone deep into prayer. And you could see the lights flashing on shore because he had radioed ahead and told them what the problem was, and they were expecting a crash landing. And as we approached the runway, the plane was still flying like that, and he couldn't get the nose of the plane to angle downward. And he said, just so that you don't panic, I'm going to tell you what I'm going to do. He says, I'm going to cut power, and the plane will go into a dive. And before we hit the ground, I'll power up again, and it will come up, the nose will come up much faster than normal because of the way that it's listing upward. And I said, have you ever done that before? He said, nope. But I'm here, so obviously it worked. But But 50 yards into the runway, the other engine went dead. So I was not supposed to die on that airplane. And then there was a time when Candy and I were flying from Baltimore to New York. And it was on one of those 50-seat commuter planes. All of a sudden, it started violently shaking. And then it flipped over. And then it was heading down. There was a lot of snow on the ground, and I was thinking, there's a chance maybe the snow could cushion the crash. But I just prayed. I said, Lord, please take care of the boys. I was pretty sure we were done for at that time. And about 2,000 feet before it hit the ground, somehow it pulled out. And everybody was waiting for an explanation. 5 minutes, no explanation. 10 minutes, no explanation. Then finally, this shaky voice comes over the PA system. So, I don't know what that was, but I'm sure glad we got out of it. And the guy sitting in front of me was a pilot. He said, I was sure we were dead. So the moral of the story is, if you're afraid to fly, fly with me. Because the bottom line is, God is in charge, and you're not going anywhere until He's ready for you to go. Okay? I told President Trump that. I said, they can try to kill you as many times as they want, but they're not going to succeed, because God has a plan. And I asked him a number of weeks ago, I said, you're 78 years old. I said, where do you get all this energy from? I said, most people who are 78 are hobbling around like me. No. And his answer may surprise you. He said, it's God. And I think that situation in Butler, PA really had a significant impact upon him. But you know, we should never be willing to get rid of the God stuff. We should always be willing to testify about what God does in our lives. And we should always live by the principles that He's given us, because it makes our lives easier. I remember when I was in college at Yale, there was a time when I was completely broke. I didn't have $1. And I needed some money badly, and I said, Lord, please find a way to give me some money. I remembered some months before that, I had found a $10 bill on the ground near the bike rack. So I went back to the bike rack. But there was no money there. But we had in one of my psychology classes a test. And an article came out in the paper that said, unfortunately, all the test papers had been incinerated, and that everybody was to report back to a certain place to retake the exam. And, you know, the classroom was full, but it was a different exam. And the questions were extraordinarily difficult, but they were written in such a way that you thought you should know the answer, but nobody knew the answers. And people started filing out of the room because they figured they would just say that they hadn't seen the notice, didn't come back for the test. And pretty soon, there were only 20 people left in the room. And then 10, and then 5, and then 3. And then I was the only one in the room. And in came the professor with a photographer and a newspaper editor to take a picture of the most honest student and to give me a $10 bill. And they were doing an experiment on honesty, but You know, honesty pays. And I found that to be the case when I was running for president, too. You know, I never screened the questions from the reporters because I never had to stop and ask myself, what did I say the last time? You know, the truth is always the truth. So you don't have to strain your memory trying to figure out what you said last time. It makes life considerably more easy. And isn't that what the Lord tries to do? He loves us, so he gave us rules, not because he is a tyrant, but because he loves us. And he wants us to have the most trouble-free life that we can possibly have. Doesn't mean that you're not going to have trouble in life. You know, I remember in 2020 getting COVID, and it was bad. The first iteration of COVID virus was so deadly because nobody had immunity. And it was a very virulent strand, and that's why it was killing people left and right. Well, I got it, and it was the worst feeling ever. I can't even think of anything that comes close to how bad I felt. They wanted me to go to the hospital, but I noticed that most of the people who went to the hospital didn't come back out. So I stayed home. My wife, Candy, had it too, but it wasn't as bad as mine. So with her COVID, she was trying to nurse me and help me back. I couldn't even keep a sip of water down. Everything would come back up. And then I was able to get the monoclonal antibody before it was okayed by the FDA. President Trump had to sign a bunch of special papers, and it was miraculous. I revived in a matter of hours. And President Trump always reminds me that he saved my life. But it was an experience that really made me think about how God, again, is in control. And you're not going anywhere until he's ready for you to go. But one of the things that happened during that whole COVID experience is that we saw how easy it is for government to get involved in our lives and to become a dominating force in our lives. And we should, as Christians, adopt the same policies like God did. God doesn't mandate, but he gives you choice. And he gives you information so that you can make the right decisions in those choices. And that's what we have to remember, and that's what we have to push. When it comes to things like immigration, we have to be compassionate, but we also have to stand for law and order. If you don't have law and order, you're going to end up with chaos like we had. And do you see how easy it was to gain control of the border? You know, they were saying, we can't do it, we can't do it. And in a matter of weeks, we gained control of the border. It's a matter of, did you have the will to do it? And then you look at another area where we're having enormous problems financially with our healthcare system. And we spend $13,100 per capita per year on healthcare in this country. Think about that. Concierge practices cost less than that in most cases. And yet we're spending that on everybody, including people who come into our country illegally. That's costing a lot of money. We need to start thinking about reforming our healthcare system. What do you need for good healthcare? A patient and a healthcare provider. Along comes the middleman to facilitate the relationship, and now the middleman has become the principal entity controlling both the patient and the healthcare provider and sucking most of the money out of the system, and they don't even need to be there. That's the problem. So we need to reevaluate how we're doing things. And in some cases, that's happened already with health savings accounts. Health savings accounts are very good because you have a certain amount of money and you get to determine how it's spent. You don't have somebody else dictating that to you. And by modifying that program just a little bit so that, let's say Mr. Jones is having a procedure and he's $500 short, Mrs. Jones can give it to him out of her health savings account, or his son or his daughter or his aunt or his uncle or his nephew or his cousin. Every family becomes their own health care entity. And all of a sudden, they care a lot more about what's happening to each other. If Uncle Joe is smoking 3 packs of cigarettes a day, everybody's hiding his cigarettes because they know what the results are. But it also brings transparency. You know, right now, the charges are bloated significantly because they know the insurance companies pay pennies on the dollar. So they jack the price way up, way beyond what it should be. And nobody really knows what the cost of anything is. People had health care savings accounts that would change dramatically because everybody would be competing for their business. And then you modify it also so that when you die, you can pass your health savings account on to someone in your family. Right now, 40% of healthcare dollars are spent during the last 6 months of a person's life doing things that make no sense. You wouldn't do those things if you could pass your health savings account on to your granddaughter or your grandson or your son or your daughter. It would make a huge difference, and it keeps accumulating. Over a course of a few generations, most families would have so much money in their health savings accounts, they could do anything they wanted to do. We have to begin to think long-term like that, because the way we're doing it now is just wasting money, getting deeper and deeper into the hole. And we're smart people, and we should ask God to give us solutions. And that's so important for anything in our lives. He's there. All we have to do is ask him. You know, when I was a senior in college, I said, finally, it's time for me to get serious about relationships with girls. And I had been trying to resist because I didn't want to get distracted. So now I was nearing the end of that journey, and I said, now it's time. And I said, Lord, please make the next relationship the right one, because I'm not going to resist it. And the next relationship was Candy. So it was good. So the Lord absolutely knows what he's doing. The other thing we should be thinking about is what kind of influence do we have in our sphere? We all have a sphere of influence that God has given us. And we get to dictate what goes on in our sphere of influence. And I want you to just try this. Tell yourself that for the next 24 hours, you're going to be nice to everybody you encounter, including your spouse. Everybody for 24 hours. And just try it and see what it's like. No nasty comments. You know, you're driving down the road and somebody gets in your lane, the one you own and paid for, you know. No nasty comments. Somebody puts their blinking light on, slow down and let them in. Don't speed up and try to block them out. But what are you doing during that time? Thinking about others first. And you'll see, making it to a game, it actually is very enjoyable. And after you've done it for 24 hours, try it for 48 hours. And then try it for 72 hours, and try it for a week. And by the time you get to 2 weeks, you're a different person. And everybody begins to notice it. And it begins to affect the way that other people react to you and in your environment. And what a difference it can make, because right now we live in a society where those who want to fundamentally change us are doing everything they can to drive wedges between us on the basis of race, age, income, gender, political affiliation, religious affiliation, driving wedges, making us think that we're each other's enemies, when in fact, we are each other's best friends and allies. And that's what gives us strength as a nation. And we can't let that happen to us. And learning to work together. Imagine what we can accomplish when we're willing to work together. I remember there was one case of conjoined twins. They were from Europe. And they came to Hopkins to be separated. We had done a number of them by that time. And I said, no, why should I operate for 20 hours and wear myself out when we have the #1 neurosurgery department in the country? We have people who are extremely skilled with vascular neurosurgery, with skull-based neurosurgery, with tissue dissection and tumor neurosurgery. I said, why not get everybody involved and have shifts where one group who's expert with bone work starts, and then the next group who's expert this and that down the line. We had 18 neurosurgeons in that case, and we were 10 hours ahead of schedule because everybody did what they did very well. And what a difference it makes when we can work together and it doesn't matter who gets the credit. What a difference that makes. Something we need to think about, and think about the country that we live in and how amazing it is and how fortunate we are to live in this country. You know, Candy and I talk about it all the time. It doesn't matter who your ancestors are and where they came from. Maybe they came from England. Maybe they came from China. Maybe they came from Africa. It doesn't matter where they came from. You're probably better off here than you are from where they came from. And we should glory in the fact that God has given us our own country. It belongs to all of us together. And that's why we're called the United States of America. We need to remember that. And our history is something that we should never be ashamed of, and we should make sure that we know and understand it, and how God is intricately intertwined in all aspects of our history. And we should not be ashamed of that. And we should stand up boldly as Christians, as people who are believers, because that's a key component of who we are. And, you know, I think about so many episodes in my life where God manifested himself. There was a little girl, she had a tumor called a craniopharyngioma. It was all along the base of her skull, investing arteries, and many people had tried to operate on it. No one had ever been able to remove it. And so I was going to give it a try. And we had done a yeoman's job, gotten it almost all out. She was the only child of the mother. Her mother's world revolved around this child. And she really loved this child so much. When I went to take out the last piece of the tumor, it was acting as a plug to the carotid artery. And blood was just squirting everywhere. It was impossible to get it under control. We tried to stuff various things down there to stem the tide. The brain was swelling. We were actually holding the brain in the skull with our hands, pulling the scalp back up over it to try to get it closed, because we knew that she was dead. But I wanted her to be able to go back to the ICU with her heart still beating, so her mom could hold her at the end of her life. And of course, she was fixed and dilated, had no neurological function. We took her back to the ICU. And the mother said, "But doctor, is there 1 in 10 chance that she could survive?" I said, "No." She said, 1 in 100? No. 1 in 1,000? She was bargaining for any hope whatsoever. And I said, the only hope is in God. And she said, "I don't believe in God." She was an atheist. And that was most unfortunate. But we worked very hard, and about 3 days later, the ICU staff came to me and they said, "Ben, I know you're a believer, but we need this bed. We need this ventilator, and this girl is dead. So can we just turn everything off and call it a day?" And I said, "I understand." I said, "But can we just go one more night, turn it off at 8 o'clock the next morning?" So there was agreement that that's what we would do. And I prayed so hard that night. I said, "Lord, in the Bible, you brought people back to life. So I know you can do it. It's not a question. And if this little girl dies, it'll be 2 lives, because her mother won't survive either." I said, "Could you do a miracle here?" And we went in at 8 o'clock that morning. Everybody was standing around, ready to turn off the ventilator. And she moved her little finger. And that was the beginning of her recovery. She eventually walked out of that hospital. But some years later, unfortunately, she had a recurrence of her tumor and she did not survive. But some years later, I was at a bookstore doing a book signing, and the mother showed up. And she had 4 other children. And she said, "I am now a believer." And we have to be believers too. You know, God is there. He will do for us what he has done throughout history according to our faith. Remember the story in the Bible of the 3 Hebrew boys and how they wouldn't bow down to the golden image of Nebuchadnezzar, and he was going to throw them into the fiery furnace. And they said, "Our God will deliver us." And they said, "But even if he doesn't, he is our God, and we will serve him till the end, and we will not bow down to your God." And Nebuchadnezzar was furious. He said, "Heat the furnace up to 7 times hotter than it normally is." And the people who threw them in the blaze were overcome by the heat, and they died. That's how hot it was. But Nebuchadnezzar looked into the furnace, saw not 3, but 4 figures walking around in there. He said, "The 4th figure is like unto the Son of God." And of course, the 3 Hebrew boys were unharmed by that, and they were promoted to even higher positions. And God has amazing things in store for us if we're willing to acknowledge him, if we're willing to stand up for him and live lives that bring honor and glory to his name. Thank you.